Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Tomorrow, we'll find out who makes the cut to sit in Prime Minister Mark Carney's inner circle. He'll be unveiling his cabinet picks in a swearing-in ceremony at Rideau Hall just 2 weeks after winning a minority government in the federal election. It was just shy of a majority, but the fourth straight win for the Liberals nonetheless. But his new team will come into place with the electorate looking for a new direction amid our trade war with the U.S., and at a time the Prime Minister is promising quick action to reshape our economy. Needless to say, there's a lot riding on these choices. So who may be in and who may be out? I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Marci Surkes, Chief Strategy Officer at the Compass Rose Group and a former Executive Director of Policy and Cabinet Affairs to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We're speaking about the delicate balancing act for Mark Carney with these picks and the challenges ahead for his new team. Marci, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, Prime Minister Carney already picked his first cabinet, but that was kind of a placeholder team, if you will, until after the election, until he received a mandate from the electorate. He has that now. So, with this new cabinet, how important are the picks, and what message will he be trying to send to Canadians?
I think the Prime Minister is trying to send two messages concurrently. First and foremost, it needs to be a message of change. The Prime Minister himself embodies change. He's new to the political landscape, and many Canadians are still getting to know him. So he is change, but of course he is presiding over a government and in many cases, members of the ministry who have been in place for a decade. So he really needs to signal some change with this cabinet. He may keep some of the same faces in, particularly for those ministers who have deep experience on Canada-US, who are interlocutors with the American administration. But he really needs to have at least a third of this cabinet present change of some form. So new blood, fresh ideas in order to refresh the Liberal brand and the Liberal government. And I believe that that was part of the signal Canadians sent in the vote. The second signal that he needs to send is that he is going to be operating a more streamlined government. A cabinet, a smaller sized cabinet, would send that message automatically. He has already done so with his, so you put it, placeholder cabinet, kind of a caretaker cabinet that was sworn in March. It was considerably smaller than the former prime ministers. Prime Minister Trudeau, Prime Minister Harper, toward the end of their mandates, they both had cabinets ranging of about 40 people. Mr. Carney currently has one that's just shy of 25. I think we're looking at a cabinet size that's probably somewhere between 25 and 30, give or take. There could be some variation depending on different considerations, but I think that's the sweet spot. And that will send a message to Canadians, to the public service, that this is a leaner, meaner cabinet, and that the intent here is to think about running the government just like you would a business.
All right, so I wanted to touch a little bit on a couple of those points. Let's stick with size for a second. By keeping a leaner cabinet, your prediction, as the numbers that you gave, is that he'll be adding a few new names or a few new positions beyond what he had before the election. Where could we see that grow? What portfolios that maybe were more streamlined before the election that might grow a little bit more that you think could be added again to this cabinet? And how will a smaller, leaner, meaner cabinet, as you put it, affect the functioning and operations of the government?
So on the first question, in this placeholder short-term caretaker cabinet, the mission there was really just to ensure that there were ministers in place with the authorities to carry out any duties required over the course of the election. Because of course in Canada, we never have ourselves in a situation where there is not a ministry. The government needs to be able to function even during a writ period, even during an election. So in that instance, it was shrunk down to size, and all of the ministers in that cabinet were double-hatted. They were given multiple responsibilities in order to keep it really tight just for that election period. And of course, Mr. Carney did not know whether he would be returned, whether we would be in a position as Liberals to form government again. So there were some, very clear double-hattings that may come off as they consider this cabinet that will be built for a longer term. So 2 examples to watch. We'll see what happens. Right now, the Minister of Global Affairs, Madame Melanie Joly, she holds the Global Affairs portfolio, but also tucked under her right now is the International Development portfolio. Those two pieces could be separated out again if needed, if it made sense in terms of the government's agenda with a G7 meeting just around the corner. That may very well make sense. The second one to watch would be what has historically been known as the Heritage portfolio. In Mr. Carney's first iteration of his cabinet, he dubbed that the Cultural and Identity Minister. That may be that the name sticks, but under that are a number of different elements, including considerations around gender inequality, including official languages. Some of those pieces, particularly where not only is it an important demographic to consider for a minister as a standalone, but also there's legislation that ministers have to be responsible for upholding, like the Official Languages Act, could be broken off. It really depends on who the faces and the people are that the Prime Minister wants to bring in. That will determine how they divvy up those roles. But I would still anticipate many ministers in this new cabinet having multiple functions. On your second question, in terms of effectively running the government with a smaller ministry, we think about cabinet very often as people, individuals, but really cabinet in its truest form and the truest definition, a government by cabinet is that cabinet is the decision-making body for policy decisions across the whole of the government of Canada. So if you're taking decisions, if you own a business or you're part of an organization, you understand, if you're on a board, sometimes having a very large number of people around a table isn't the best strategy for getting to decisions. So what is happening here in this case, the Prime Minister is looking at his options, and he's saying, I need cabinet to be an effective decision-making body. And in order for that to be the case, I think we need to have fewer voices, fewer competing voices potentially at the table, which is not to say groupthink. In fact, I think you can have a very robust, healthy dialogue at the cabinet table. It's easier to do that with fewer people sitting at that table. So I think that's part of it. Decisions coming out of cabinet need to be taken urgently, expeditiously, particularly at this moment of geopolitical consideration and crisis in some respects. So cabinet really needs to be able to move on a dime, and that makes it, that makes the imperative of keeping it smaller all the more rational.
Okay. And on a note that you touched on earlier, when it comes to the U.S. trade war and this critical time that we're in, is it that you believe that many of the U.S.-related ministers, such as our Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, Global Affairs Minister Melanie Joly, as well as Public Safety Minister David McGuinty, do you believe that they'll stay in those positions because of relationships that they've started building and we'd be looking for stability? Or could Carney use this opportunity to sort of put new people in place to reset the relationship? And should we read in anything into the fact that those ministers were in Washington for that trip to the White House?
I would read into their presence at the White House only that they have already established some relationships. Mr. Carney is the newest player on the field. And so he was leveraging their experience, their relationships, their know-how in that first critical encounter. So that made a lot of sense. It is entirely plausible that Mr. Carney will take this opportunity to reset the bench, and it could very well be that those ministers are changed. I would note Mr. McGuinty actually hasn't been in his role at public safety for very long. He only began in that role in the fall, but has moved very quickly on border-related issues, establishing relationships, particularly on the fentanyl issue, which, of course, Canada has been in the crosshairs with respect to the fentanyl trade and the correlated tariffs. But I think there is some reason to suspect that particularly when you have a minister like Minister LeBlanc, who has now established a very clear line of communication with the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who has been both positive and negative towards Canada in different outings in different instances. But the line of communication there is open, and it seems to be a fairly regular dialogue. I would suspect that if you have an open line like that between two individuals, you would continue to harness it and probably keep Minister LeBlanc in place, if not specifically in the role he's in now, in some other connected role where he's interfacing with the American administration, because those relationships are hard to build, and all diplomacy is based on relationships. So I would suggest that, if I were betting, and I'm not really a betting person, but if I were, I could make a pretty good case for why I would bet on those three staying around, if not in their specific portfolios in the cabinet.
Let's talk finance. Typically, prime ministers don't like to change their finance ministers unless they have to in order to make sure there's economic stability for the country. However, Francois Philippe Champagne hasn't had a lot of time in this role. As you mentioned, Carney could be looking for a reset. We've also never had a central banker as a prime minister before. So what happens there? Do you think Champagne stays as finance minister, or could his tenure possibly be coming to an end?
Well, I'm always loath to make guesses and predictions about who's who in the zoo, as we say here in Ottawa. A few things. I think quite rightly. I mean, Mr. Carney, there's no reasonable approximation to Mr. Carney's experience in the Prime Minister's office. Exactly. I mean, the closest approximation would be Paul Martin, who, of course, had been Minister of Finance before becoming Prime Minister. But Mr. Carney does have unique experience that he brings to bear on this position, and I imagine he will have many views on the work of the Minister of Finance, including helping to shape the budget and budget decisions, probably from first instance, and not only at the tail end of that process, as is sort of typically the case between finance ministers and prime ministers. So he will need someone in that role who shares a vision, who can test him and challenge him, and really go toe-to-toe with him in terms of the considerations around funding decisions and the fiscal envelope. So I think it could very well be Mr. Champagne, but it is not impossible to imagine that for a role such as this, where it really will have to be a partnership, that Mr. Carney may look to someone new, perhaps somebody who he has worked with in the past in the private sector. So I think this is one where it really could cut either way. As you say, Mr. Champagne has only been there for a very short time, but he is well road tested as a minister, very well liked within caucus, a consummate retail politician. He is much more of a retail politician than is Mr. Carney. And so that may be the consideration around a complementary skill set in terms of actually getting out there and selling the government's economic message. So it really, those considerations could cut either way.
When you talk about somebody who may have worked with Carney in the past, I don't want to make assumptions on your behalf, but maybe you might be referring to Tim Hodgson, who was elected in Markham Thornhill and was an advisor to Mark Carney at the Bank of Canada as well as at Goldman Sachs. So there's a history there between those two. Could we potentially see him make the vault from rookie MP into cabinet because he's somebody that Carney may trust?
I think it's I think that's a reasonable consideration. I think Mr. Hodgson is on most people's short lists of predictions for who will be a rookie to find their way into cabinet. He obviously has a deep experience in business that would be important at this time to have in cabinet. Reminds me a little bit of Bill Morneau, the former Minister of Finance, who also had exceptional credentials on Bay Street and who was brought in as a rookie MP into the finance ministry. And Tim Hodgson has a similar kind of background to draw upon that would be of appeal, I would suspect, to Mr. Carney and his advisors on the transition team.
More on the big story with Marci Surkes, Chief Strategy Officer at the Compass Rose Group and a former senior advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, in just a moment. Marci, let's talk a little bit about regional representation, which is always a big factor when it comes to picks for cabinet. Any prime minister wants to make sure that every region of the country is well represented with some key roles. But there are some areas of the country where the Liberals don't have a wealth of names, let's say. So could some people make cabinet just because they were elected in a certain area?
Well, look, regional representation is a critical component to cabinet making, and for good reason. It is important for the Government of Canada to be reflective of every region of this country if it is possible. The last iterations of the Trudeau government, they were unable to select a minister who was an elected person from the province of Saskatchewan, for example, where the last time the Liberals held a seat there was in 2019. So that has been a clear gap in terms of Liberal cabinets since the departure of Mr. Goodale from the Liberal caucus. So I would say it is quite reasonable and for very, very appropriate reasons to suspect that the Liberal member who has been elected from Saskatchewan, he represents the Northern riding, which is largely Indigenous riding. I think there is good reason to imagine that a lone member from Saskatchewan would be in cabinet. And like I said, quite rightly, it will be important for Saskatchewan to have a voice at the table, just as it will be incredibly important for Alberta to have a strong voice at the table, to be an effective voice for Albertans with the federal government. The Liberals have elected members from both Calgary and Edmonton. It is entirely plausible that there could be more than one minister from Alberta, especially given the context, the nature of the relationship at present with Danielle Smith, which is somewhat frayed, even though it is a new relationship. There will be a lot of reparation to do. Albertans need strong voices at the table, and I believe Mr. Carney has the option to select at least one, if not more, ministers from that province right now, and that will be essential. So it is a good news story that there can be members of cabinet from every province of this federation and from the north as well. So I think that Mr. Carney has better optionality than his predecessor had in terms of who to select from the regions.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, it's Eleanor Olszewski in Edmonton, Corey Hogan in Calgary, who was a deputy minister under the Alberta NDP when they had power under Premier Rachel Notley, and then Buckley Bélanger in northern Saskatchewan, who was also a former cabinet minister in Saskatchewan. So, they definitely have some background, at least, to jump into those positions. How much do you think picking one or two MPs from Alberta and Saskatchewan to join the cabinet, how much do you think that will address or alleviate some of the Western alienation and separation talk that we've been hearing as of late?
It is going to be an iterative dialogue, and it would be too facile to say that the considerations around Western alienation and separation and that deep-rooted sentiment can be solved simply by having more voices at the table at the federal cabinet. It is an important step. It will matter a lot in that dialogue and getting that dialogue onto a constructive path. But it is in and of itself not a quick fix. I think Mr. Carney is live and well aware to what is happening in that province, in the province of Alberta in particular. Although it is not restricted jurisdictionally to the province of Alberta, there is this feeling that Ottawa has not taken decisions in the best interest of Westerners or in the interest of the prairie. And I think that this is something that is going to be high up on the list for Mr. Carney while he is concurrently trying to manage the U.S. administration and bob and weave with the president, as we saw in recent days. He is going to have to be laser focused on ensuring that we can bring that conversation back to a better place. And that's going to start by having representation, but it is going to continue by understanding that conversation has to be constantly tended. It is an evergreen issue that will only be solved with frank, open dialogue and with, real commitments from Ottawa to understanding the importance of the energy sector, conventional as well as renewables.
All right. And a couple of other big-name politicians in their jurisdictions were able to get elected as Liberal MPs in the last election. We got Gregor Robertson, former Vancouver mayor in BC, but also Quebec's former finance minister, Carlos Letao. Do you think that they get serious consideration for cabinet picks based on their previous experience in politics and being big names that help the Liberals in this election?
Well, certainly, Mr. Carney has a really strong slate of candidates to select from for this cabinet. Despite the fact that over the course of the election campaign, we didn't see too many quote unquote star candidates on the road with Mr. Carney. It really was about Mr. Carney. Even the platform was Mark Carney's plan for Canada. It was really a campaign that was very leader focused. And, the campaign wasn't that long ago. We can recall it was really a head-to-head matchup between Mr. Carney and Mr. Poilievre in a presidentialized style election. The truth is, Mr. Carney has managed to bring a number of very new, strong faces forward. And two of those, Gregor Robertson and Carlos Letao, from different parts of the country, both bring tremendous elected experience, political experience forward. In the case of Mr. Leitao, a very respected former Minister of Finance in one of the country's most populous provinces, a province where Mr. Carney enjoyed considerable electoral success. I imagine that the Quebec caucus is going to be very strong and vibrant in this government, and that the cabinet picks out of that caucus are as well going to be very strong and influential. Mr. Leitao is definitely one to watch out of the province of Quebec. And then from out west, Gregor Robertson was showcased on the Lower Mainland. He is obviously a household name in and around Vancouver and beyond. I think it is reasonable to assume that someone with that much profile would certainly be considered for one of the cabinet slots out of British Columbia.
Even when the team is picked, when we move forward, there's not a lot of time before Parliament resumes. How hard is that going to be for these ministers to sort of hit the ground running? And do you expect, since you mentioned at the start of all of this, that you expect Carney to run cabinet and his government more like a business, do you expect more minister independence than we saw in the previous government under Justin Trudeau?
I mean, I'll take issue with the lack of ministerial independence comment under Mr. Trudeau, but that's fine. We can agree to disagree. Look, here's what I anticipate. It is going to be a cabinet that is going to get down to business right away. The few things that we know are that it is going to be leaner. It is still going to maintain gender parity. There are going to be, like I said, at least a third, if not more, new faces at the table, which means that rookie ministers are going to have to face a very steep learning curve in terms of getting ready for prime time to take decisions very quickly in the best interest of Canadians. I anticipate that when they are sworn in, that's once that ceremony concludes at Rideau Hall, it will be right down to work. That is the message and the signal that Mr. Carney has already sent with his own tenure as Prime Minister, short as it has been. I anticipate those ministers will be getting briefed up by their deputy ministers, staffed up. All of that will happen even before the recall of Parliament on the 26th of May. So it's going to be go, go, go. It is going to be a very tight and bright legislative agenda for the new government in June in the Commons and the Senate. We know that Mr. Carney intends to bring forward a middle-class tax cut. We know that he intends to have some legislative initiative to eliminate interprovincial trade barriers, at least the federal components related to interprovincial trade barriers before Canada Day. If those initiatives have to come through law, they are going to have to move very quickly to make those timelines. So there's a lot that's going to happen very fast. So if you're interested in politics, this is going to be a very, very fast dancing kind of political season when the House returns.
Marci, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge and your assistance in this deep dive into cabinet making. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Cormac. It's my pleasure.
That was Marci Surkes, Chief Strategy Officer at Compass Rose Group and a former Executive Director of Policy and Cabinet Affairs to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.